Okay, we're gonna start. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our second screening in Untitled Chapter Film Week. Today, we're going to be screening Dima Srougi's Sebastia, a short documentary work about Sebastia, the Palestinian archaeological town that sits on top of a hill northwest of Nablus. Following the screening will be a conversation with director Dima Srougi, who is a Palestinian architect, designer, artist, and educator, who will be joining us in conversation in English after the screening of the movie. The documentary is 24 minutes in Arabic with English subtitles, and I hope you stay with us for the conversation. And also, if you have any questions for the director, you can send in your questions through the Q&A window through Zoom. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the screening. Everyone for staying with us, and I hope you can hear my voice. Is my voice clear? So thank you, Dima, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this conversation following the screening. Dima, please, can you, I'm going to let you introduce yourself, so please go ahead.
I will, and thank you for having me, first of all. Mostadara and to you for hosting. I've been going to Mostadara since I was a little kid, so it's a huge honor for me to share my work with you. And I see some of my students have joined, and some family, and some of our friends from Sebastia as well. Abu Yasser Al-Kayed, Ahmed Al-Kayed is with us as well. So I want to say thank you for joining, and of course, thank you for all the work that you've been doing for Sebastia. Obviously, this film would not have been possible without him and his guidance and energy. So I appreciate him for joining us this evening. So just quickly about my background, I am a trained architect. I studied architecture, that's my background. Since graduating with a master's in 2016, I've been kind of thinking about what it means to be an architect in the region, and how we can use the background of architecture to reveal forgotten and silenced narratives of the global South, but specifically in Palestine. And moving back here by choice in 2016, I worked with Riwaq briefly, which is a conservation center that kind of has this massive goal of renovating and conserving 50 villages in Palestine, historic villages. And through that work, I started working on multiple scales as an architect and designer, not just a city scale with Riwaq, but also smaller scales, looking at using design as a tool for reactivating the dying industry of glass blowing. So I worked with glass blowers, and kind of connecting my research from the work that I was doing with Riwaq, which is focused on conservation and historical and archival work through research for them, and connecting that research to archaeology, to the practice of archaeology, and of course to the material culture of glass. So through that research, it wasn't, my practice isn't only just finding hidden narratives, but also using the narratives that I do find to create new forms and new methodologies to share, to kind of not only reveal, but to disseminate that information in new ways. So whether that's plaster casts of maps, glass blown objects that are quite contemporary, but then with them the story is carried through, and the same with film. So film is another medium that I use as a practicing artist at this point. On the other side of my other hat is an academic. So I've been teaching. I'm currently teaching at the Royal College of Art, leading the city design program there. And actually, it's an incredible position that I have, an incredible institution with a lot of support from the Dean, Adrian Lahoud. And what we're doing with the head of the department, Godofredo Pereira, is to use Sebastia as our first case study for thinking through city design as the methodology of our lens. So Sebastia will be the first case study in a series of annual case studies that we look at, where archaeology is kind of the site of urban struggle in Palestine. So that's just a quick summary.
Maybe I would like to know more, like, since you said you're an architect by education and training, and you're also a designer who works on archaeologically informed design projects. Like, how does your background in architecture inform your research in archaeology?
That's a really great question. I mean, I think the practice of architecture, as we understand it today, as you know, as the public understands architecture, is the scale of a building. Whereas in my case, the way that and not just my case, but I think where the discipline is moving in forward and has been in the last 10 years, is thinking about architecture as a tool rather than a practice, in a traditional sense, where you kind of design a building from schematic phases until construction. But the history of architecture, as we're told and as we were taught in a pedagogical sense, is a very specific one, where you're kind of taught the history of architecture through starting with the Roman Empire and the Greeks, and then going through the Renaissance and so on, and the Enlightenment. And when I did study that history, what I realized very, very quickly is that it's taught from a very specific lineage. And I was wondering, while I was a student, how do we think about the alternative narratives? Because, thinking about the good example of that is archaeological one, where you're taught the kind of the orders of our architecture, meaning, looking at the history of the columns. And the history of a column, as it's taught by Western institutions, you start with the Ionic column, you go to the Doric column, and then you have the third typology, which is the Corinthian. And those are the kind of the defined, they're not archaeological in the sense, they're architectural historical artifacts. And what you realize very quickly as someone from Palestine is that we have columns and capitals here that predate the Roman Empire, and they look slightly differently. And out of curiosity, I was curious about what that meant in relation to the history of architecture, and why are we only taught from this point as if it was zero? So there isn't really a beginning or an end for the history of architecture. And you can think of archaeology as the architecture of the past. So in a sense, it's actually not very different. It's just a matter of who has the power and of the narrative. And what I'm trying to do is to think about not only the history of architecture, but questioning the discourse, not questioning the science itself of archaeology, because there is a genuine science that's very useful. What we are questioning in this project and as architects is how are our disciplines, architecture and archaeology, abused and weaponized for building specific narratives that serve the interests of those in power. And I think working with archaeologists like Silvia Truini, who's a partner of mine on this project, and the collective Depth Unknown, and also Dr. Nadia Al-Hajj, who's been an incredibly helpful advisor, who's an anthropologist, has been an incredibly a supportive figure in this, in these questions. And on the other hand, there are very useful things about the history of architecture as a discipline, and it is mostly about thinking creatively and how do you use softwares, and how do you the more technical aspects of thinking of an idea conceptually and then executing it. You learn that from architecture school, really. That's the less exciting point, though.
No, that's a great answer, because I'm gonna go into the technicalities of the work that we saw, and we also have a question on that for later. I'll keep it for later. But first, just for the people who might have missed the screening, can you briefly explain the project? What is the village of Sebastia? What is its importance in the Palestinian struggle for freedom, and why did you make this documentary?
So I'll quickly summarize the film. It's really in 3 sections, and it begins with an introduction on the village of Sebastia, which is a small, it's not really a village, it's quite a large population. They have a municipality. It sits in the northwest of the city of Nablus in the West Bank of Palestine. It splits into 2 types of areas. There's Area B and Area C, which means the control of the archaeological site is split between the Palestinian Authority and Area B, which still has already quite a few restrictions from the Israeli authorities. And then Area C, which is where most of the archaeological ruins and monuments are, is under the total control of the Israeli Authority, the civil administration. Now, the introduction of the film is looking at, the first section is the colonial history of archaeology in Sebastia, which dates back to 1908 when Harvard University did excavations there using labor, excavation labor from Sebastia itself and from the neighboring villages nearby. It was incredibly well funded. It was funded by the director of the Semitic Museum at Harvard University, who happens to be a Zionist, a very, very wealthy New York businessman that was in finance on Wall Street, even like in the early 1900s. And it was one of the most well-funded excavations in the history of Palestine. They had hundreds of Palestinian labor working on it, including women and children. And then, the conversation goes into the history of colonial archaeology there and their role in imposing this Zionist narrative using science to prove the Old Testament, into the second section, which looks at the current occupation of Sebastia, the expansion of Israeli settlements nearby, how the establishment of the settlement happened, and then the third section. And, of course, the history of displacement of archaeological artifacts from Sebastia elsewhere over the generations. And then the final section looks at how, and it's kind of led by Abu Yasser, looks at, the connection of ecological terrorism in the area, how the settlers today are using the site and abusing it by burning trees, by polluting the water, by coming into the site and using religious tourism as an excuse to harass and to threaten the villagers there, the Palestinians, who are incredibly resilient. And there's this almost now a violent ritual of resistance and oppression, resistance and oppression that's never ending. And really the point of the film and why I got into it was a few reasons. The first one is that we all see this pattern happening that was, written about by Nadia Abul-Hajj in her book, Facts on the Ground in 2001, where this pattern is very, very clear. The relationship of dispossession of the Palestinians from their homes and the expansion of the Israeli settlements in relation to archaeology. Even Sheikh Jarrah, by the way, which is happening right now, and Silwan, the history of Silwan, and the dispossession of the Palestinians from Silwan, which is now really accelerating, is if you dilute it down, it's an archaeological argument that they have, where Alad is this Zionist group, settler group that's well funded by Zionists from all over the world. They use all of that money to establish this tourist attraction of the city of David, as they call it, which is on top of the village of Silwan. And this archaeological space now is becoming like a performative space of Zionism, right? Where they come with tour buses and kind of perform the history of the site from a very specific Judaizing narrative. And what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah as well, by the way, if you look at the arguments or even like the Hebrew text that's around Sheikh Jarrah, they argue that it's not only because of the housing issues with the UN and so on. It dates back to this one tomb that exists in Sheikh Jarrah that is a very small tomb that is very valuable to the Jewish narrative, despite it being, Sheikh Jarrah named after the physician in the early, 1700s. It's been it's the idea of the pattern that I'm really interested in. It's happened in Silwan, it's happened in Sheikh Jarrah, it's happening in Sebastia. It's just a few years behind. So it's almost like there's like a defensive strategy to get the story out there, to like reveal this pattern of the weaponization of archaeology that Nadia Abul Haj started exactly 20 years ago. And I feel like then, it's happening we have thousands of archaeological sites in Area C that the exact same thing is happening to them. Taqwa was also, there's a short footage of Taqwa, which is a small town near Beit Lahem that is also starting to see some of the same activity. So it's the point is to get the story out there, because I think archaeology is absolutely critical to the what's happening on the ground, the dispossession and the acceleration of dispossession.
And like when speaking of archaeology as a field of knowledge, like how do you see other similar archaeological practices in other places outside Palestine, occupied Palestine? Do you think it's productive to look at the association between architecture and colonialism in Palestine in relation to other places?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the other studios that are taught at the RCA in the past looked at the Atacama Desert in Chile, and actually how they're not archaeological. I mean, it depends what you define as archaeological, but these were indigenous, really incredibly beautiful drawings that were done, engravings that were done on a massive scale in the Atacama Desert in Chile by the indigenous community there. But now the mining companies in Chile are using the same space to extract minerals and I don't remember exactly what the extraction process is for but there is a massive dispute between the violence of the miners and those incredibly wealthy companies with the indigenous community in Chile. And this isn't just happening here, but what's specific to us, and I think is really important to talk about, is the militarization of archaeology. And this is the only archaeological practice in the world that authorizes machine guns and bulldozers and the militarization of archaeology, where you literally have a so the archaeology department of the civil administration, which is the Israeli archaeological department within the West Bank, it's under the Ministry of Defense. This is unheard of and absolutely horrifying. Not only is it illegal to excavate in the West Bank according to the Hague Convention, it's also the only militarized archaeology in the world. So your question about whether it's important to look at other cases, absolutely. And creating solidarity and a network with other archaeologists, like those working in Atacama, and we met actually in person at the Sharjah Architecture Triennial in 2019, and there was an incredible talk that they did that's online at the Sharjah Architecture Triennial website. If anybody's curious, I can send you the link. But these networks are still small within the archaeological discipline, but I do see some of them reaching out and starting to create a larger network for us to there's a conference I might be going to in Italy in May to do exactly that, to start a wider conversation about the discipline on a larger scale. Yeah.
And
Mishmish. Sorry, that's my stuff.
No, it's okay. So in her book, Facts on the Ground, Palestinian anthropologist Professor Nadia Abul Haj argues that in order to understand the dynamics and significance of archaeological work, it cannot be analyzed solely within nation-building framework. And she's arguing for to look at it also through the lens of colonialism too.
Absolutely.
And,
yeah.
So speaking of yeah, please go ahead.
No, that's exactly my takeoff point for this film. Like, the reason that it was structured in that way is because we can't only talk about it as a contemporary settler problem, right? It's like this isn't just happening post 1948. There's a century-long history, starting with Harvard in 1908, and even before then with the founding of the Palestine Exploration Fund. And the prerequisite to all the archaeological work was the colonial extraction of information through the practice of map making. I think map making led us to the place where we are now, and the Palestine Exploration Fund, who have been incredibly helpful actually with our research with the studio. Today, they realize what they've done in the last century, but the history of map making, absolutely, it was done by the British Army before the excavation of Sebastia. It was a prerequisite. So connecting the colonial history to the settler colonial activities today and to the apartheid regime is, a direct line.
And what do you see this practice, like the importance of articulating the colonial project when we speak of archaeology as a field of knowledge? Do you think of it as a practice of decolonizing archaeology, let's say, for example?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I do think of, this is like an early iteration of possibly moving towards a decolonial archaeology. There are a couple of movements within the archaeological discipline where, they call themselves new archaeologists. And there is this, there's a lot of questioning about the subjectivity of archaeology and whether it can ever be non-subjective and purely scientific. And those are really interesting debates to read about, because there is, it becomes quite philosophical question of like, how do you ensure that archaeology is never weaponized, or how do you ensure that archaeology is never exploitative or extractive? And one of the early questions was, can we use technology to make sure that that's not the case, where you can start like laser capturing lasers and x-rays of the ground without ever having to excavate. And for me, that's an exciting opportunity. But at the same time, it's like, well, then there is still a subjective relationship to diluting that information down to whatever you find useful. And this questioning of the value system also of like, how did the archaeologists in the past decide what was valuable and what was not? And this is something that comes into my glass practice a lot, is replicating and the idea of contemporary forgeries and creating glass artifacts that look identical to the ones from the past, as kind of this tongue-in-cheek joke about the value of the artifact that's now under a spotlight in a glass vitrine behind a museum. And how do we label things? How do we categorize things? And the subjective power of an archaeologist, of an archaeologist, or someone working in the antiquities market is massive. So what's interesting walking around Sebastia today is that you look down on the ground and you still see artifacts that weren't taken by the institutions that were excavating. And this, the ones that were taken were proving a specific narrative, the Iron Age and the Israelite, but the Canaanite remains on the surface. Or, for example, the Temple of Kore was excavated, but then it was reburied because they didn't find anything that they were interested in. And so this subjective relationship to archaeology is one that I'm curious about, and it would be great to continue the conversation with the archaeologists to think about how do we, I don't know if we're ensuring a non-subjective practice, but I think having the conversation is a very new thing. It's not one that's been going on for long. So that's exciting to hear about. Absolutely.
Definitely it is.
Ian Fodder is an archaeologist that I've been looking at his work a lot, and he would be a useful person for anybody that's interested to read. Fodder.
Well, that's great. I'm going to jump in a question from the audience, and also a reminder, if anyone from the audience has a question, to please send it through the Q&A window. And I have a question from Karim Estefan. It says, thank you for sharing your excellent film and important research. I was curious about the virtual rendering part of the film, as the footage is quite different from the archival videos or the present day documentary. Could you tell us something about this excerpt, maybe in the context of city design, as you mentioned you're teaching urban design through Sebastia?
Yeah, so the scan that was taken from the archaeological site is it was done by an incredible company that's based in Palestine, 3D Lions Hearts, who we were working with and hoping to do workshops with the students and maybe continuing to work with photogrammetry and making sure that the entire site is scanned and preserved virtually. The reason that happened, the reason that I did use it was for a couple of reasons. One, I think it's really so what we're doing with what we're doing with the studio right now with city design is the first term was to build a living archive of Sebastia, and what that meant was kind of collecting archival information that we find from all the excavations and the reports and the technical documents that we have, but also collecting phone footage that Abu Yasser sent us and the people from Sebastia sent us. But it was also really critical for us to create our own content, to make sure that we're also preserving the archaeological site as it is today. Because, for example, one of the students' work right now is kind of documenting the change of the archaeological site over time. So if you take the single monument of the amphitheater, for example, and you look at it from the photos of it from 1908 to 1930, the second excavation to the 1960s, and the third excavation to 1970, and the fourth excavation, and then today, it has not only has it not been preserved, which it's up for debate whether it's important to preserve or not, but it has the objects. Some objects are missing. Some of the seats of the amphitheater have gone missing. You see bulldozer marks from the Israeli authority that's there today, and I think documenting that change is important for future research. So the living archive will be open source, and anybody that wants to know anything about Sebastia will be able to go on our website and see all of this information that's geotagged and with the cloud tagging system. So the more data that we have, the better. But it's also useful to use that those 3D scans and the photogrammetry for us to also produce new work from that, rather than collecting archival as well, because it's what's happening today started colonially, as we talked about, but documenting the abuse of the ground now is just as important as finding those revealing those silenced documents, because those diaries from Harvard are quite revealing as well, like looking at how the excavators dealt with the Palestinian community and the words that they used to describe them. So using that with the bulldozer on the side that has a point cloud of the bulldozer on the sides is, I think, was also just as powerful to have. It's a diary in one way.
And I hope that answers Kareem's question, but maybe more on the technical part of your film. Do you look at it as purely as a documentary form, or like in also back to Kareem's question when it comes to the rendering parts? Like it reminds me like some of the aesthetics that you employed. It brings to mind, it's not similar, but it brings to mind like practices such as forensic architectures, what they're calling now investigative aesthetics. So do you see yourself working in that domain in some way or another?
Yeah, I mean, of course, forensic has been hugely inspiring, and they, the work that they're doing is life-changing, literally, not for just me, but for the cases that they're fighting for. And if you don't, whoever, if anybody's joining us that doesn't know who forensic architecture is, it's led by Eyal Weizman, and they kind of collect evidence based by case, so it's event based, and they kind of use that evidence to take to court, literally, and try to fight all over the world, not just in Palestine. They are working on a case in Gaza with archaeology, where archaeology is involved, but I think it's the only one where they're focused on archaeology. So I'm excited to see when they launch that soon. But I think the way that my practice is slightly different, although a lot of the evidence aesthetic is there, and I appreciate it, and I think it's really useful and of course I carried that from forensic and others that I find really inspiring. But it's also very much based on oral history and also speculative work. So, the studio that we're doing and some of the film itself leaves room for speculative, imaginary spaces, but also oral history and tradition, and the kind of the voice and centering people rather than the science of things is, for me, very important. So, centering the people in the village is, for me, is more important than documenting things scientifically using, evidence. Although I think that's, it's critical. So that's why I'm trying to do both at the same time. There was a question about the aesthetic of the framing, or the framing within the frame. I'm not sure if that you asked that specifically, but what I was interested in while making this film was also thinking about time as non-linear, and thinking about, as a kind of continuation from my interest in archaeology, and the assumption that archaeological time is linear. Using this frame within a frame, and kind of juxtaposing found footage with documentation that I did myself, the interviews that I did myself, and layering them in a way that wasn't two-dimensional. So, I think the frame within a frame gave us some freedom to play with time in a way that I found quite liberating.
That's quite interesting. Because it really works for me, like the formal aspect really informs the social aspect too. Just a final reminder for the audience to send in, this is your last chance to send in a question. And maybe Dima, if you can talk more about Palestinian archaeological efforts, such as Rawaq or other like initiatives or foundations and institutions that are making efforts to counter the Zionist narrative.
Well, Rawaq, I don't think they would consider them, they are not, it's not an archaeological effort. I would say it's an architectural effort and a conservation effort and cultural heritage effort, which is a massive one. And, they're celebrating their 30-year anniversary this week. The work that they've done over the last 30 years, no one else has managed to do. And I think it's one of the most important documentation. Their archive is incredibly useful, and the physical renovation and the making sure that the historical villages are intact year after year, and trying to guarantee reactivation is powerful work. But in terms of archaeological efforts, I only know of a couple of archaeologists, Palestinian archaeologists, and in conversation with them, because they are practicing archaeologists, they are very much focused on area A and B, and which leaves a massive void in the critical work that's happening in area C, and the illegal work that's happening in area C, and the losing of control. Even though it absolutely is illegal, that there are all of these there are looting efforts by the IDF that we need to document, and I don't believe that's happened. I don't believe that's being archived by anybody. Certainly not by the archaeology community in Palestine. But what I do know is that there is an Israeli NGO, interestingly enough, called Emek Shaveh, left-wing Israelis that are based in Jerusalem, that do document the way that archaeology is being weaponized. But I've been looking for Palestinians to work with me on this, and I have not been able to find anyone yet, because the archaeologists that are practicing have so much work to do in area A and B already to preserve and to excavate and to ensure, but they're also led by the Palestinian Authority. So there are a lot of limitations to what they can do there. They're part of most of their work is part of the Ministry of Culture and Antiquities, which is on its own quite a bit of work to do. And they don't have authority to work on Area C. but if anybody listening knows somebody that I should talk to, that would be incredible.
If anyone from the audience also knows, or like can add some links,
The more the merrier.
I think we have another question from Steve. Are there European archaeological organizations or universities currently involved in research on these sites you are working on?
Not so. What we do have is a solidarity network that Abu Yasser told me about, that I met recently on Zoom. It's actually based in the UK, called Hafsa, and it's a group of British volunteers and comrades that have set up almost like a sister institution to Sebastia in the UK, in Hanwell. They're incredibly supportive. They raise awareness and they raise a lot of money and fund for Sebastia, for the farmers to plant olive trees and all sorts of different kinds of trees to be planted in Sebastia for any renovation work that has to happen there. So it's a kind of it's an NGO, I think, technically, but I don't believe if there's a university that's working on the same sites that we are working on. Definitely not Sebastia, but there are other. I actually don't think that there are European archaeological organizations that I know of, at least working on it. There are archaeologists like Osama Hamdan and Carla Benelli, an Italian, and the Palestinian Osama Hamdan, who I should have mentioned in the previous question, who have worked on Sebastia for many years. I think with foreign aid, like the Terra Santa organization. So there are a few organizations that help support Sebastia, and specifically in renovation. And creating a public space, but I'm not familiar with any universities that are working on Sebastia.
And we also might be the final question from the audience, from Muawiyah. Do you have any idea how the Jordanian government obtained the artifacts from Sebastia, which are displayed at the Jordan Museum?
Yeah, so between the 1948 Nakba and the Naksa in 1967, Sebastia was under Jordanian authority, under the Jordanian control, and there was an excavation that happened in Sebastia. The third excavation at Sebastia was in 1964, I believe, or 65, maybe Abu Yasser would know. And during that time, when that excavation happened, some of the more valuable artifacts were taken to the funding institution, which at the time was the Antiquities Authority of the Jordanian rule. So it's the same thing that happened in every excavation. So now the Palestine Exploration Fund has a massive archive of objects and books and diaries and drawings from Sebastia from the 1930s excavation. So does the Hebrew University. The Harvard Semitic Museum has all the diaries from 1908, but because it was under the Ottoman rule at the time, most of the physical artifacts were taken to the National Museum in Istanbul, where they are now. But Harvard was able to keep all of the photographs and the diaries and so on, so that they're there and they're available online. So every kind of funding institution or authority at the time kept the most valuable artifacts and took them back with them.
And maybe just one more question from my end, because I know some of our students from Darat al-Funun Summer Academy are interested in working with both documentary form and some aspects from if we can call it investigative aesthetics in the Palestinian context. As someone who works in this field and like someone who directed this work, would you give them any advice on how to move forward as artists / architects, designers, and researchers?
That's a good question. Are they working on topics specifically, or in general working on documentaries and revealing kind of these hidden narratives? Yeah. It's a good question. Advice for someone working on, I've only made 2 films. I think being experimental with what feels like a gut move is always the right thing to do. I edited this film during COVID. The reason I started with filmmaking was because of COVID, actually. It was commissioned by Eflux and the New Institute in Rotterdam, and we were supposed to create a physical exhibition in Rotterdam in early 2020, and then COVID happened. And because of that, they were like, well, why don't you create something that would be virtually accessible for everybody? And so, that's how the film started. And I had maybe thousands of documents already, and footage and text on Sebastia that I had collected over the 3 years before working on Sebastia. And so I think doing the serious research beforehand and making sure you have more than enough footage and all sorts of material, found artifacts, found objects, found material, but also creating your own, like the 3D modeling and the new softwares technology that I used with the 3D scanning that I did with the 3D Lionheart. And then putting it together is kind of like creating a collage where the narrative becomes super clear all of a sudden. And that moment of clarity for me is the most important moment making a project, because when you're creating glass blown objects and putting them on display, the story is interpreted in so many ways unless you have text on a wall, or unless you're there explaining, because they can be interpreted subjectively, in whatever way that you understand them as the audience. But with a film, because there are talking heads and a script that you're following, and some, a series of images and so on that you are putting in a row, or even layering on them on top of each other, what's really important is that your story is clear, or your intention of what you're trying to say is clear, even without audio. And you can do that. You can do that with a series of moving images. And I found that incredibly powerful, and I fell in love with the medium. And ever since then, I've continued to work on film. I'd like to do one on the history of glass blowing in Palestine. So hoping to find some funding to be able to do that. And then another experimental film was almost like a cathartic experience for me to work on, because of the clarity that you get from filmmaking, was during the, whatever you call it, the last revolution, starting in May and June. During that time, I had a folder from historic footage of the Nakba and 1967 of refugees, Palestinians, leaving from Palestine to crossing the Alembi Bridge into Jordan, and a series of other footage of, people walking through the streets barefoot with all their suitcases in 1948. And the experimenting of that with audio, and actually reversing that footage, using like the reversed footage of people crossing the bridge and during the Nakba and the Naksa, was incredibly healing. Seeing people cross the bridge in reverse, you never really know what it's going to do to you until you see it, and that was really fun to do. So I think you have to have that, like, there's a moment where you watch your own work and you're like, okay, this is doing something to my body and to the story that is really not only useful for me, but I think could do something for a lot of other people. And that's where it gets really fun.
That's a great advice. And with that, I would like to thank you, Dima, for joining us tonight. And thank you also for letting us screening your movie. I don't want to call it movie. Like, I'm still not sure if you want to call it a documentary work or a video work. What do you prefer, a documentary?
Can it be both?
Both. So thank you again, Dima,
somewhere in between,
for allowing us some of your time. And thank you also for our audience who joined. I would like also to remind our audiences that the final screening will be on Tuesday, 21st, with 3 films from the occupied Golan Heights by director Randa Maddah. director and artist.
Amazing.
So hopefully we see you on Tuesday. Thank you, Dima, again, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you to Dar al-Funun and to my friends and family and everyone for joining. And Abu Yasser.
And have a good night. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye.